When we do get started with the call, this is good practice. You'll be able to drop questions throughout the presentation via this chat box, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the call. I'll do my very best to weave your questions into the presentation, and we'll hold a full 15 minutes at the end of the call for any questions that we don't get to cover. All righty, lots of folks calling in from all over. We see Fairfax, we see Michigan, Virginia, West Virginia, California, another fellow Mainer on the call.
Hello.
Hey there, how are you? We are going to ask everyone to stay on mute throughout the call, just to keep it from getting
All right. Okay.
on
Thank
here.
you, sir.
No worries. And if you do have any questions, drop those in the chat. But it's great to see everyone, and hello there. All right. Well, I think that we've reached a good chunk of people in the actual Zoom call to get started. Again, my name is Rob, and I am the head of field and mobilization here at goodparty.org. I am going to be our host this evening, and I am joined by two wonderful experts who are going to help talk all things get out the vote and the strategies for really driving voter engagement. The call will cover some of the fundamentals of voter outreach, effective get out the vote strategies, some of the best practices for engaging with voters, and the tools and resources for managing outreach and get out the vote efforts, many of which we have available through goodparty.org's suite of tools. And the goal here is to effectively provide especially first-time candidates with the knowledge and tools that you need to be able to maximize voter turnout as we enter this final stage of election season. I know if you're anything like me, you've got a countdown somewhere, probably just off screen, with that big day in November and how many days left. But before we dive in, I do want to give an opportunity for our experts to introduce themselves, starting with Derek and then Alex Barrio. Both are members of the political team here at goodparty.org. But Derek, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us about your experience with Get Out the Vote and voter contact. And Alex, I'd love for you to do the same.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for having me here. Yeah, I'm Derek. I have been working on campaigns almost exclusively in voter contact programs for the last 15 years. I'm excited to be talking with you guys today about how we can use that voter contact to ultimately drive folks to the polls come November. Kick it over to you, Alex.
Thank you. Hey, I'm Alex Barrio. I have worked in voter contact since I was 19. Every election cycle I ran myself in 2016 and 2020 for the state house. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about some of these, the things I've learned across 8 different election cycles at every level from local to federal.
Awesome. Well, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick off the conversation with a couple of questions for our experts. I want to start with a basic overview of voter outreach fundamentals. So why don't we start with explaining why this is important? So what do you think is the importance of voter outreach in a political campaign?
Yeah, I think honestly, contacting voters is one of the most important things a candidate can do during their campaign. A well-organized and active voter contact program can help build strong relationships between you and the voters that you're asking to support you in November. And it sort of has the added benefit of engaging directly in your community gives you these insights as to what issues are most important in the community, and ultimately, can help you develop policy positions and honestly serve as a basis of communication to support your community or district's long-term needs as you transition, hopefully, from candidate into public servant after November.
What's your take, Alex?
Yeah, look, voters are the key to victory. I mean, voter outreach is important because we live in a democracy and they're the ones who ultimately decide who represents them. And it goes back to you as a candidate. Why are you running? You're running to represent people, your neighbors, your community, your state, your congressional district, whatever. And so you got to talk to the voters. You got to connect with them. You got to let them know your name, so that when they go to the ballot box, they fill in that circle next to your name and you get into office and are able to do all the things that you want to do and that you're pledging to do to improve your community.
And what do you guys see as sort of the key components of a successful voter outreach strategy?
Yeah, I feel fairly strongly here. I think a good, successful voter outreach strategy is targeted, it is purposeful, and it is consistent. Targeting, which I think I can't imagine we're having a conversation about voter contact without talking about how to target these voters. But it's an essential step is identifying the key voters that we need to reach our win numbers. And so as you're beginning to think about sort of what your get out the vote program looks like, you sort of have to ask yourself the question of, am I looking to persuade potential but uncertain voters who haven't made up their mind? Am I looking to mobilize my base of support? Is that going to get me my 50% plus one to get over the election day? So I think making sure you're talking to the right people is very important. By purposeful, I mean, you got to know also why you're reaching out to them. There are different messages for different audiences and for different needs. If you're reaching out to I'm going to use the phrase mobilization, turnout, support universe, support audience, sort of interchangeably here. But if you're reaching out to a turnout universe, you might be talking about your campaign a little bit less and talking more about the excitement of going out and voting, right? Where if you are reaching out to folks who are in that murky middle and still haven't made up their mind, you're going to want to make a personal connection and connect with that voter on an issue that matters to them. And you have to sort of know where that conversation's going before you begin your outreach program. And by consistent, they say that somebody has to come in contact with your campaign 5 to 7 times in order for that name recognition to really begin solidifying, which means that you'll likely have to rely on a variety of different outreach tactics if you're going to consistently reach that core audience in a way that ultimately has sticking power, so they remember your name and check off the box in November.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't have much to add, actually. That's a really, really great summary. Look, at the end of the day, the reason you're running is the voters. Whether you know it or think about it in that way, shift back into that mode of these are the people that I want to represent. You're running for a reason, and just that targeted talking to your voters, not wasting time with people that are strong supporters of your opponent, being consistent, getting out there every day. Every little bit helps. Some days you're not going to want to do it. You're only going but you got to talk to a couple voters that day just to keep yourself motivated, keep the door going. And then purposeful, just what are you saying to these folks to make them resonate? Are you talking to the issues that matter to the constituent and to them? Because that is what will convince them to vote for you. If they know you care about what they care about, you're golden. That's a vote in the bag. And so making sure you're saying those things is crucial.
I want to double click in on consistent. Another way that I've heard that same point made about the 5 to 7 touches is to think of it as layered, right? Like you're getting multiple touches to the same voter and you're sort of layering those on top of each other. So if a mailer goes out and it hits the mailboxes ahead of your canvassers going and knocking on the door of that person, they're having a warmer conversation because it's, oh yeah, there's that person who I got the piece of mail on, or if I saw a digital ad that had this person. This is why TV is so ubiquitous in some of the larger campaigns, because it's a good way to get a blanket touch to pretty much everyone. And sometimes when I think about that consistency, I think of voters not to belittle anyone, but it's kind of voting is a little bit of a chore, unfortunately, for a lot of Americans. And when I think about trying to get the children in my life to do their chores, oftentimes I need to remind them multiple times. I have to mention it to them in person. I got to shoot them a text message. Hey, did you clean your room? I got to actually check in and see if the room is clean. And, it takes, in my life, at least 5 to 7 touches to get anything done around the house. So that consistency, that layering piece is important. But what I really want to focus in on is that idea of targeting, right? That's the first point that you made, Derek. How should candidates identify and target their key voter demographics? How do you pick the right targets for the right message?
I mean, for me, it starts with your win total, right? You need to know how many votes you actually need to win. You're running for city council, there's 10,000 registered voters. How many people voted in the last election, right? And if you're running in a presidential election versus a midterm year or an odd numbered year, turnout is going to be different. You know that more people are going to come out for a presidential race than they do for other races. So looking at those numbers, and then you want to shift into, okay, what is my target universe to get to that number? And there's a bunch of different categories to look at, right? Likely voters, which are people who have voted before and vote consistently. New voters, people who maybe have just moved into the district or have just registered since the last election. So they've never voted before. This is their first election. Especially, I remember my first election was 2004. Actually, no, my first election was in 2003. It was right after I turned 18, May 2003, mayoral runoff in Jacksonville. And I remember I voted for Nat Glover. Like, it was a local race, off year election. You're mostly local candidates. When people meet candidates at that young age as new voters, they will always remember them and always remember Nat Glover. Partisan considerations, obviously, we're nonpartisan. So you want to stay away from targeting super Democrats, super Republicans, people who are super engaged in the primaries, and really look for those MPAs or those soft partisan swing voters. And then there's demographics, right? Like, is there a way you can set yourself up from your opponent? On the one hand, are you a young person running against an old person? So go after younger voters, right? Regardless of party. Are you a woman running against a man? Reach out to female voters. Like, look at those demographics that set you apart from your opponent, and reach out to those voters. Also look broadly at the district, especially if you're running for city council. Are there areas, and really this is for any district, are there communities that have been neglected by the incumbent where you can go and reach out and be the person that represents them? Are there voters on the wrong side of the tracks that are being ignored that can be communicated with, and how can you turn them out regardless of party? And then, of course, are there any regional or local issues you can highlight? And remember, it's not about demagoguing. It's not about being negative. It's about creating that contrast, that past versus the future message. Here's the problem. I want to be the solution, and our current existing political infrastructure is not. So who are the voters most receptive, to that message in your community?
Yeah, and when I think about targeting, generally speaking, when I'm trying to figure out what the core audiences are for any particular campaign, I generally break it down into 3 subcategories, right? That supporters, turnout, mobilization universe. That low hanging fruit, those folks that are most likely to support you. The persuasion or undecided universe, and then those folks that would be potentially low hanging fruit, likely to support your opponent. Right now, when at all possible, right, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to talk to folks that are never going to vote for anyone other than your opponent. Right, that's probably time best spent with somebody who hasn't yet made up their mind. So typically, we want to remove those folks. And the supporter list is going to be sort of your fertile ground for trying to recruit volunteers, potentially trying to raise some contributions, and ultimately it's going to be a bulk of what makes up the get out the vote universe once you're ready to start driving people towards the polls. So it's important to sort of think about those categories, think about the demographics that might sort of make up those categories, and then and maybe most importantly, test those assumptions that you've made. We can do all kinds of different types of testing, either through door-to-door canvassing, through text campaigns, through phone calls, where you can start gathering some feedback on how well that target is fitting your assumptions, and then you can make adjustments on that based on the findings you get. I think it's very important, that you always think about your targets as sort of a dynamic moving goalpost, right? There's always room for improvement, always room to drill down. So that's my general thoughts on targeting. Sorry, it's rambled on a little bit there, but I think it's very important.
Yeah. Well, I want to pull a question out of the chat here. Lynn asks, what do you do when someone asks you who you'll be voting for president or governor as a prerequisite to hearing more from you about your campaign, which I know has happened at times in some of the texting campaigns that we've helped to manage for people, as well as with candidates on the door. It's not unusual for someone, especially a partisan voter, to sort of ask you, which team are you on, essentially? What are your thoughts about the best way as an independent or as a goodparty.org candidate to respond to that line of questioning at the door, on the phones, or through voter contact methods?
My go-to for any time that somebody wants to talk about a race that is not the race I'm working on is ask them the same question. I just reflect the question back at them. Who are you supporting for president? Well, why don't you tell me who you're supporting for president and tell me why that's so important to you? Right. At the end of the day, I think everybody, any relationship, politician to voter, boyfriend to girlfriend, father to son, right? People want to feel heard and they want to feel acknowledged. But obviously, it's something very important to them if they're making it a prerequisite to having that conversation. Turn that into an opportunity to have a conversation about what is important to them. I think that's one of the best things you can pull out of an interaction like that. And if that fails and they still want to sort of be on the partisan train and keep you there at the door, I think it's fine to say, look, I'm here to talk about my race for Rochester. I'm running for state rep here in Rye. If you're Lynn, so I think you just flip it back to what's important to them. That should always be the core of every conversation you have with a voter. It should be what is important to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. My default is always to lean back into your own race and why you're running. And so, if they're pressing you, I think you should need to be honest about why that is, but tie it back to your campaign. If you're voting for Jill Stein because Jill Stein is the environmentalist candidate of the Green Party and that's what your campaign's about, then be honest there and just tell them. But it's a moment where a voter will not expect you to be authentic, and you can really lean into your authenticity and establish yourself as very different from your opponents, not just by pivoting, but by really embracing that question and embracing the conversation. Like, ask them who they're voting for and then talk about who you're voting for and why that matters to you. And even if you disagree, it's a moment of connection with a voter that's going to stick in their mind and bring them to the polling place for you.
I think this also underscores the value of having good voter contacts data. Knowing what party this person is registered with might sort of shape the way that you respond to that. Because if you're voting for the presumptive person or candidate of their party, then it makes it a little bit easier to sort of fearlessly say, yeah, I'm voting for this person, and I'm doing so because their values align with my values on issues X, Y, and Z, and those are issues that I'm going to be championing if I get elected as an independent. So that makes that a little bit easier. And if you're looking, if you know that you're voting for someone who's opposed to their sort of voter registration, it gives you the ability to enter that conversation with a little more temerity. But I think what Alex and Derek have underscored here, the most important thing is to be honest. and to be authentic in whatever answer you give. This opens up the conversation to a pretty solid topic to shift into, which is what are some common challenges that you think people face, candidates tend to face in voter outreach, and how can they be addressed? We got into a super specific challenge by way of some, I think, what feels like some partisan shoulders going up around the ears. But what are some other challenges and how can they be addressed?
Yeah, I think there are, a bunch of different challenges that come to reaching out to voters. I think one that I hear a lot from candidates and then sort of sometimes in a dismayed way is sort of what the contact rates are and how they vary. The success rate for actually reaching a voter and having a one-on-one conversation with either a candidate or a campaign supporter. I will say that direct voter contact does have varying contact rates, and you can talk to your political associate and get a general sense of, if I knock on 50 doors, how many people should actually talk to me, right? And instead of getting dismayed when it's only 5, you have an understanding of, 10% contact rate overall, that's like fairly standard. That's not bad. The other big one that sort of comes with contact rate is time. Most direct voter contact efforts are or can be time intensive. And I think one of the sort of common pitfalls around building a voter contact plan is making sure that you're budgeting enough human resources and time to accomplish some of these really big goals. And probably the one that affects almost everybody equally is money, right? Different forms of contact, and I'll split contact into 2 kind of categories here of direct voter contact and passive voter contact. And we can talk more about sort of what falls into each one of those branches. But I think that when you are doing direct voter contact, it tends to be fairly expensive if you're not doing it with volunteers, and unless you maybe use goodparty.org to get some of those services for lower than market rate. But time and money and contact rate are the ones I hear the absolute most about from candidates. And lastly, one that I think that's most important and is a fairly common pitfall is just tracking that information, managing that data. What do you do with the data you collect when you're doing direct voter contact, and sort of how do you build a feedback loop so that your audience is getting stronger over the course of the campaign? So those are the common pitfalls that I hear that are around building voter contact operations.
Yeah, I mean, besides all that, the biggest thing is just endurance. You are in a marathon. We're all counting down. There's 61 days left. But it is very exhausting especially on those days where you're knocking 100 doors. You might talk to 20 or 30 people on the street, people walking their dogs, maybe go to a festival. Like, you're just talking to so many people and you're exhausted. And then it's like, you got to get up and there's 60 more days of doing this. And so making sure you're taking the time for yourself as a candidate to be mindful, not stretch yourself thin, but really plan accordingly, know your limits, but know that, there's going to be a sprint to finish that last quarter mile, that last 2 weeks when early voting starts. Like, you're going to be going all day, every day to try to talk to those voters. And so making sure you're taking care of yourself, storing up that energy, sleeping as much as you can, eating healthy, and just getting out there so you have that energy. Just because voter contact, it is work. We all know running for office, campaigns, they are work.
Yeah. If I had one thing to add, I would certainly say being able to make this rather large task of voter contact into several smaller tasks. So if you know that you have to knock on a certain amount of doors by the end of your campaign in order to speak to everyone in your district, breaking that out into weekly goals, into daily goals, and even by shift goals for the folks who are coming in and volunteering for you or for yourself. A lot of the races that goodparty.org candidates are engaged in are races where candidates are able, if they start early enough, to knock every door in their district themselves. And there is such weight with being the actual candidate in front of the voter and the impact that that has, the weight that that has. It's a memorable interaction that people have, especially in a life that is increasingly online and sort of impersonal. To have that civic servant right there in front of you, it has a tremendous amount of impact. And I think door knocking is a great way to also refine your message and to stay close to the district that ideally you're going to be representing. So let's shift into best practices. I want to hear about the best practices that Derek and Alex have for engaging with voters, starting with what are the most effective ways to engage voters throughout the campaign, sort of your evergreen approaches.
Yeah, the sort of evergreen approaches to voter contact. And I'm going to very specifically break these down into direct voter contact and passive voter contact. But, examples of frequently used direct voter contact is door-to-door canvassing, phone calls to voters, mailers, political mailers, emails, SMS, and MMS text campaigns, which I think are huge right now. Social media, I'm going to sort of categorize possibly in both direct voter contact and in passive voter contact. But your passive voter contact, that's your immeasurable forms of contact. That's going to be your radio and TV ads, banner ads, letters to the editors, articles, your social media, yard signs, and anything that puts your name out there and put your campaign out there where we can't directly say, okay, this is X voter and they're going to be supporting X candidate, right? So that would be considered passive. So those I think are typically the modes of contact that are used most often in campaigns. But I would also say one thing that's sort of come around over the last few cycles as a strategy for direct voter contact is something called relational organizing, where you have your supporters actually reach out directly to their friends and family who live in the district and have them essentially give the same pitch that the volunteers are given over the phones or over the door to make those personal connection, to ask them to vote, because study after study after study after study shows that the more personal you can make the ask, the more likely that person's going to be to say they're going to vote for you and then actually go out and vote for you, which is the goal here.
Yeah, food for thought on that. Research shows that relational voter contact can bring voter contact up by 20% versus the 1 to 3% boost that traditional get out the vote methods have. And it makes sense. If your family member, if your neighbor, if someone you respect tells you it's really important for you to get out to vote and vote for this candidate, it has an even higher impact than a volunteer or a stranger. So again, I'll drop that here. I want to elevate a question. This is a timely one. This is from Sandra, who has a special election next Saturday on the 14th. Obviously, she doesn't have a lot of time left. For Alex and then Derek, what do you guys think is the best thing that Sandra should be focusing on right now? Is it texting? Is it door knocking? Is it phone calls? Is it some combination of all of these things? What's your advice for her?
It's everything. I would definitely start basically at your house and then just build a circumference around there. And because you have such a short amount of time, try to run up the score and get as many votes as you can from your neighbors, from your community. I think this is a really good opportunity for relational organizing, calling everyone you know in the city that you're running for, making sure that they are telling their friends and family to get on the ballot, trying to throw a house party, and over the next few days, just as a GOTV party, maybe at your house, maybe at a supporter's house, just to get people there, and using text messages to spread the word about yourself. Definitely posting on social media. It is a special election, so turnout is going to be abysmal. If you are going to be canvassing, definitely want to have a very highly targeted list of vote by mail voters, because they've already got their ballots in the mail. So knock on their door, call them, text them. At this point, I don't think mailers are going to be effective. You can get one out, that'd be great, but it's really, really late, and you're just focused on, can I run up the scores around my community and with the people I know, knowing that it's a special election. Turnout's probably going to be 10%. You're not going to need that many votes to get across the finish line versus the November election when the presidential poll is there. So that is what I would try to do. Just run up the score as much as possible with the people that you know, and just grind.
Yeah, I think the answer, much like Barrio said, just to double tap on this, I think the answer is yes, right? I think you use all of those forms of direct voter contact. In an ideal world for me, it's a text followed up within the next 2 days of you knocking on their door, and potentially a follow up right around the time to submit their ballot by phone, or potentially by door again. I'm not sure what your volunteer operation looks like, but yeah, I think a layered approach, especially in a very small special election, is a very, very strong path to finding the voters you need to win.
Yeah, I would double click in on that, Sandra. I would probably start with thinking of texting as an opportunity to hit a broadcast audience. It's broad, it's cheap, it's effective for reaching the most amount of people, but with the idea that it's also probably not going to be as impactful as a phone call or a door knocking conversation. So you might put out the last minute reminders, you might put out the basic reminder that there is an election coming up in that text message. Your ability to persuade someone to vote for your campaign is going to be a little bit on the lower side. So for those voters who you know are going to turn out on their own, who you need to have break your way, those are the people, those high priority voters. I would put them into a door knocking universe. And Alex pointed to a lot of ways to get momentum and energy to get people to show up and sign up for those door knocking shifts or those phone calling shifts. But I would sort of treat broadest audience for texts and then sort of a hyper focused high priority audience for door knocking and phone calls. I'm going to pull another couple of questions here from the chat before we move into the outline a little bit more. Do we suggest directing people to our website during a public forum, or is that precious time not valuable? So I think the question here being, as you're speaking publicly, as you're pointing, if you're at the door with someone, does it make sense to point them to your website, or is there a low likelihood that they'll actually follow through on that?
I think it makes sense if your website is your name, right? So like my website was alexbarrio.com. You're just saying your name again. You're getting it in their head. alexbarrio.com, yourname.com. If it's something like, Pride for East Hollywood, something more branded that's independent of your own name, then it's probably not worth it, is my take, because you're not getting a touch of your name. They'll think of that. And you really want them to think of your name, which is also just generally when you're running, please use your name in your website because you need to build your name brand.
Great. And do you guys recommend appearing at the early voting polls to reach people as they're voting early?
I think that really depends on what the rules and regulations are in your community. I know in my community, you are allowed as a candidate to be there at early vote, but you're not allowed to campaign. You can say, "Hi, I am Derek. Thank you for voting." And that's pretty much the boundaries of what's acceptable outside the polling location. So, I don't think it hurts if you have nothing else going on that day. It's almost always better to try to grab a new voter who hasn't voted yet than try to persuade someone who's who's walking in the door. I think at that point they probably made up their mind. And I'm not so sure that just a quick handshake outside is going to be the difference. So for my position on that, yeah, it probably makes more sense to do doors on early vote day, or organize some sort of volunteer event, or even like a get out the vote event. But you should be driving people towards the polls and not necessarily talking to people at the polls.
No, I think that's exactly right. Early voting totals generally are very low. You'll have polling places where there'll just be a couple dozen or a couple hundred people voting at an early voting site. And so to stand out there handing out yard signs, it might be something for a volunteer or handing out literature to do if that's what they're interested in doing, just as voters are going up. But yeah, you're not allowed to campaign there. You can't really talk to voters as they're going up to the polling place. So it's much better to create an event around the polling place, canvass the area around the library or wherever that early voting is occurring, and drive people there to the early voting. Spread awareness about early voting, but don't necessarily spend your day there.
Any thoughts on the best days and times to host a house party? Going back to the house party recommendation from Alex.
I mean, I think there's no real bad time to do it except when people are at work. I mean, I think if you're doing it in the weekday, something in the 5 to 7 window probably makes sense. If you're doing it on the weekend, maybe closer to the 11 to 2 window, somewhere in there. But ultimately, I think regardless of what day that you plan it on, if you're planning at a time people can get to, the most important thing is actually doing the outreach and the work to build it. And I think if you're doing that consistently, then ultimately it doesn't matter a whole lot whether you have it on a Tuesday or a Thursday, as long as you're giving people a date, a time, telling them what to expect when they show up. So that's my answer for you, Len.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, logistically speaking too, it's like you want to make sure people can get there. So, if you're in a busy city with a lot of traffic, a 5 p.m. Wednesday is not going to work, but a 7:30 p.m. Wednesday might. Tonight, we talked earlier, is the first day of the football season. Tonight would be a good night for a house party because a lot of people are going to watch football. So you'd invite them. So you can also do themed events like that, right? A Halloween house party right before the election. Things like that are also really good, but just making sure that people have time to get there. And especially on the weekends, if you're going to do something like a barbecue, looking at the weather, because if it rains, even if you have a tarp or a covered porch, people turnout's going to be low. So just being aware of those little logistical things and making sure there's no barriers for people to come to your event.
Yeah, I like the idea in the context of a voter contact house party, having it in the mid to late part of the week in the evening, and using it to then point the people who come to the fun thing, the party thing, maybe asking them to do a couple of phone calls that evening, but really try to convert them into signing up for a full shift of canvassing on the weekend on a Saturday or a Sunday. And to one of the questions that's in here, what are the best times for door knocking on the weekends in terms of when people are most likely to be home? I tend to like to get people out around noon to 1, with the idea that you can do a little bit of warm up doors from noon to 1, and then from 1 until about 4 o'clock on the weekend. I think is sort of like the prime time where people are home. Maybe they're doing yard work. They have a little bit of leisure time. They're more likely to talk to you. In the evenings on the weekdays, I do like to do from 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock. I'm going to come back to some of the other questions in here. We're building up a really wonderful backlog, but I do want to get into the sort of core question of how candidates can tailor their messages to different voter groups. And I think that this is a good one for Alex Barrio to take point on.
So yeah, in tailoring, it goes back to what Derek began with, being purposeful, right? So when you're talking about tailoring your message, you want to really think about what you want to say specifically to them and why you want to say it to them, right? And you want to focus always on your message, why you're running, what are the issues that you care about, your constituents care about, and your contrast with your opponent. What sets you apart from them? What makes you different from them? You know, I mean, I have a couple of examples, like, are you a mom running against two men for school board? You know, are you a religious minority or racial minority in your community? Are you a young candidate running against an older person, a newcomer versus somebody who's been there for 4 terms? Making sure that contrast is established and then framing it around sort of that specific purposeful message. You know, even like geographically, is there a certain sinkhole in your neighborhood or a streetlight that never works and it caused a bunch of accidents? Go to that neighborhood and message all around it. That purposefulness around there will let the voters know that you're one of them, you know what they care about, and you are going to do something about it.
There's a good question in here from Rich. Any specific thoughts or studies to point to reaching extremely rural voting districts? Rich lives in a very rural area of Minnesota. So most people don't even live in a town or city, but rather townships and unorganized areas. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, and probably Derek's as well, as people who live in Maine, where we have more unsettled land than almost any other state. Much of our state is unincorporated townships. I will say that I have found that when organizing in these areas, having localized trusted messengers becomes more important. So in Minnesota, I can imagine you guys probably have a pretty strong farmers bureau, for example. That would be an example of an organization that I would be actively looking for an endorsement from. But I've worked on campaigns here in Maine where we've even looked to utilize, there's a chain of stores called Marden's here, and we've gotten the Marden's lady to do campaign advertisements, who's essentially the mascot for that chain. And so there are localized messengers, I would say. Looking for the community hubs in these places as well, you know, 4-H clubs, the places where people meet. I grew up around a small town that I looked up some election results a couple of years ago, and the candidate, the ballot initiative I was working on won across the state, but in that particular town, we lost 13 votes to 12 votes. That was turnout in the town of the West Forks. And in that town, if you want to do anything, you actually have to go to the bar, which is one of the only businesses in town. You go to the Marshall, which is a bar that's been open serving people, and a restaurant and an inn serving people since they ran logs on the river in Maine. So those community hubs are important. And then targeting low propensity voters in those types of districts has a disproportionately high impact. The idea that you could turn out 2 extra voters in a election, like I said, 13 to 12 in the West Forks, makes a really big difference. So any additional thoughts on organizing in places like that, Alex and Derek, to help Rich with his campaign in Minnesota?
Yeah, I think I cannot double click enough on Rob's point to local trusted messengers. I think it's huge. I also think, you know, if you look for potentially community events, regional community events, especially where you might be able to draw in folks from, you know, multiple communities, even if it is rural, and also to go back to how impactful it is. Most people who live in very rural places don't have candidates come to their door that often. I think they're an often overlooked demographic in a lot of campaigns, and from a numbers perspective, I understand why. But as a rural voter myself, you know, it matters a lot when a candidate comes to my door and takes the time to drive out to little old Livermore Falls to have a chat with me. So I think it can be a very rewarding experience, both for you as a candidate and for a voter in a community like that. I also think, and I can't stress enough, if you're trying to do door-to-door canvassing in a rural area, recruit somebody to drive you. door to door, somebody else to handle the navigation, so that you can focus on, recording the data from the last conversation you had and preparing yourself for the next. Instead of it's crazy, especially if you do it over the course of the next 60 days. If you were to canvas every day, how long does it take you to get in and out of the car, go to the next place, set your GPS, do all that? You can get whole hours extra of campaigning out there by just being efficient with what you're doing. So that would be my recommendation for rural folks. Try to look for regional things, look for trusted messengers, recruit a friend to help you out, to help you cover ground.
Awesome. Well, Alex, I want to pose a question towards you. How can candidates use data and analytics to improve their voter engagement efforts? And voter data, voter file access, this is one of the core things that goodparty.org is trying to make more readily available and remove the cost barrier towards. But how can candidates who get that data use it effectively?
So the key with using data, it goes back to your original voter contact metric, right? Like, who do I want to talk to, and why do I want to talk to them, and what do I want to tell them, right? So targeting, using that data to target, and we can work with you individually to cull that list, right? To make sure that it is effectively targeted. We can take out people who never vote. We can take out, strong Republican partisans if you're an MPA running against a Republican, for example. So you don't spend too much time talking to voters that are unlikely to vote for you based on how much time and resources you have. So that's where the data comes in. Just using it, knowing how to use it effectively, and then using it effectively. And then with analytics, the analytics is the data you get from your data, right? So analytics are, what are voters, how are they responding to your message? When it comes to text messages, and we can work with you on setting different texting campaigns, but how are they responding to those messages? What do those responses look like? And how are you using that to improve your message, to improve your data tracking? Because on top of that, besides the data you get, the voter data, this analytics is a lot of data tracking, right? Keeping track. Because when it comes down to get out the vote, you want to make sure you're calling people who've already said they're going to support you to remind them to vote, and you're talking to people who are most likely to vote for you, whether it's certain communities that you've had a really good feedback from, certain groups of people that are strongly in support of you because of your message. So that's sort of how it all kind of fits together, the data and the analytics portion.
Speaking of data and sort of records, we have a question about how someone can access their opponent's voting records in city council, which I assume means the things that they've voted for during their time serving on city council. It says "and general" here. So one thing I will say is there's no way of accessing who or what your opponent might have voted for or against as a voter themselves. But in terms of what legislation they've supported and sponsored, typically the town offices or town websites will have records of those. So the best way to do that would be to reach out to the actual town website. And oftentimes there are meeting minutes that you can look up, or there's an actual record of the votes that took place. Pivoting into practical advice, I'd love for Alex and Derek to sort of share some of the best practices that you have for door-to-door canvassing, phone banking, and digital outreach.
All right. So best practices, number one, always goes back to consistency, right? Which Derek mentioned earlier, and it's still, you want to get out there on a regular basis. If you're out there, especially if you want to mobilize voters, it's important to let them know you're going to be out there every day from 3 to 7. So volunteers can come in. With volunteers especially, you want to have tasks that they can plug and play. And so being consistent in your voter outreach, if you want volunteers to do voter outreach, is crucial. If you're doing phone banking, same time every day. with some flexibility based on the volunteer's timeline, of course, or their schedule. But making sure you're being consistent with phone banking and canvassing. And you just, every day helps. Every voter you talk to is another voter in the bank, and you're just trying to bank those votes as you're making your way towards election day. And then when it comes to digital outreach, targeting is also very crucial there. Facebook is actually very good. I mean, we all know our news feeds are algorithmically pumped with things we are designed to like. But on the candidate side, that is really helpful when you're targeting voters and you're talking about the issues you want to talk about. Like if you're running on a clean elections campaign and public financing, you'll find people on social media that you can target who care about those issues. And so finding people who care about those issues that you're running on is really, really crucial when you are doing digital outreach, especially with digital ads on any sort of social media platform. Derek?
Yeah, so I can get into the nitty gritty of sort of practical advice around canvassing any day. And if you're not canvassing yet and you're interested in canvassing, definitely reach out to your political associate and start really thinking about that. But study after study after study after study again shows that the canvassing is the most effective form of voter engagement in terms of actually banking votes and turning folks out to the polls. And every single door that you knock on is an opportunity to connect with people in your community. If you are one of my candidates and we've got you set up doing doors, I'm sure you've heard me say this, but one of the things I always recommend, just as a piece of practical advice, is if you are going door to door and you're leaving campaign lit at the door, before you go out, buy yourself 2 pads of Post-it notes, right? Hey, sorry I missed you. If you want to touch base, here's my phone number, my email, some form of contact. And then put your name on it, slap that on the piece of the lit and leave it at the door. It's wild how many folks will actually follow up. And that's another piece of data. That's another vote that will, hopefully get you into office. But like I said, if you guys want really sort of in-depth practical guides on the ins and outs of canvassing, reach out to us. We'd love to help you with that, get you your map set up, get you some tools and best practices in your hands to really do that effectively. I think with when it comes to making phone calls, I think the practical advice really comes down to be polite and don't take anything personal. I think it can sometimes feel discouraging. I think especially with contact rates on phones the way they are now. It's not 2008 anymore, and people don't pick up their phones as often. But make sure that when you are, setting these phone banks up, that you are targeting folks that are more likely to pick up their phone. If you want to reach folks on the phone, call landlines, call folks 55 and older. That's sort of a prime demo for phone outreach, and text for folks on the younger side. But yeah, don't get stressed. Don't take anything personally. 8 rejections and 1 vote is still a vote, toward your goal. So that's my practical advice for at least doors and phones.
If I can add one thing on doors, this is sort of a worst practice. Make sure when you're leaving those notes behind and campaign literature behind, you do not put it into people's mailboxes. Anything that isn't mail cannot be put into those mailboxes. And in the context of campaigning, it is one of the easiest ways to get slapped with a fine. So door hangers have to be hung on the doors. Campaign literature that doesn't have paid postage on it needs to be left at the door. You can roll it up and put it in between the actual door handle and the door, but you cannot put that into mailboxes. And it is a fine in almost every single state, and it is a fine every time that you do it. So if you go out and drop 100 pieces of literature, and 100 pieces of literature go into mailboxes that are not supposed to be there, that's 100 discrete fines, and it gets expensive fast. So hopefully I see Alex and Derek nodding their head. They've heard horror stories just like I have about candidates who have made that mistake. So make sure that you're teaching folks that. Any final thoughts on best practices for voter contact, Alex or Derek?
Do it consistently. That I can't say it any more clear than that. If you don't have a plan to reach out for voters, make one. End of the week, that's your homework, guys. If you don't have a voter contact plan yet.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about get out the vote strategies. What is get out the vote? GOTV is the acronym that we throw around and sometimes forget that it sounds like a spinoff of reality TV. What is GOTV and why is it critical for campaigns?
Yeah, GOTV, get out the vote, is the mobilization phase of your campaign. It is essentially the last swing at bat to get your supporters to the polls.
Exactly. And it should be focused on people you've already spoken to, that you know are your supporters, and or people that you know are likely to be supporters, friends of friends, people you've met at different events throughout the course of the campaign. It's really where your data storing is put to the test. Like, how many people can you call and actually turn out to get to your win number?
And how can candidates develop a really comprehensive get out the vote plan?
Got to think about what is a comprehensive get out the vote plan is. And it starts with your vote number, how many votes you're trying to get, and planning between today and election day. How are you going to talk to all those voters? If I need 10,000 voters, then that means I need to hit at least 20,000 voters across 10,000 doors, right? Because average you have 2 voters, it's like 1.5 per house. So you want to make sure you're hitting those daily goals, right? And your weekly goals. And if you miss a goal, you miss a day, you said you want to do 50 a day, you missed a day, then you try to pick those up over the next few days to stay on track. But really building a plan that is consistently hitting your voters every single day, collecting that data of your supporters, noting it, and then making sure that those people are on your list for your GOTV at the end of the month or at the end of the campaign to get them out there so they can vote for you.
And a lot of the strategies that work during the voter contact phase, the sort of persuasion phase, they translate right over into get out the vote. But the messaging is a little bit different. So what are some of the strategies for mobilizing voters on election day? And how does the core message in each of those differ from when you're reaching people earlier in the campaign cycle?
Yeah, so at this point in the campaign cycle during GOTV, obviously you have all the same tactics for reaching out to these voters. You can reach them at the doors, you can reach them via text, you can do the relational organizing, but at the core difference between your GOTV messaging and the rest of your campaign messaging is your GOTV messaging isn't inherently about you, right? It should be focused on the actual act of voting, the logistics around voting. Are these voters going to need an ID? Are they going to need a ride to the poll? Do they know where the polling place is? Do they know when it's open, right? Those are the conversations you should be having during the GOTV phase of your campaign. Again, because you should only be talking to folks who are that you know are supportive. And whenever possible, you are framing voting as easy and something that is impactful. But it's a logistic conversation, and you should be, one of the best practices that have come out over the last maybe 10 or 12 years is the importance of making a plan with voters, actually getting them to say, you know what, I'm going to go vote in the morning. I typically bring my wife and my daughter. We typically go and we all vote together. We're going to do that before we drop her off at school, right? And actually making that plan gets them to essentially verbalize and internalize the plan they made, and makes them significantly more likely to actually go out and vote. But the conversation is logistics based.
And how can candidates track and measure the effectiveness of their GOTV efforts? both
Uh,
along the way and in retrospect?
Yeah, I mean, along the way, I mean, the effectiveness of any sort of voter outreach effort, whether it's persuasion or GOTV, is going to revolve around how many voters you're actually able to reach and deliver a get out the vote message to. And that is why, you're going to have to employ a variety of tactics, because ultimately, we want to talk to people. We want to make sure they have a plan to go vote. In retrospect, obviously, the best metric is election day, right? Overall, you're trying to talk to people to get to your win number, but there is no better poll than the polls on election day, right? And you'll be able to sort of judge the success of your program based on the sort of historical turnout versus the turnout you were able to drive in your election. So that's a big piece of it. But one of the things I think that sort of we should plug into here is, for a lot of folks, your GOTV might happen in phases, right? Like if you're in California, you have 30 days from tomorrow before early voting, right? And so you might be reaching out to those folks and having that conversation around folks who are maybe permanent absentee ballot folks, and making sure you're doing a targeted sort of GOTV message to those folks before they cast their ballot earlier or by mail.
Perfect. So I want to talk about some of the practical advice again. What are some examples that you can provide of successful get out the vote campaigns from past elections, whether those are ones that you yourself admire, Derek, or ones that you've been a part of?
Yeah, so I think ones that I admire, I mean, I think Obama 2008 did a very successful job in states like Indiana and North Carolina, which have not supported Dems since Obama's 08 election, and his race in Florida in 12, which were subsequently went the other way in the following elections. I think both of those elections were won by typically, if you work in campaigns, what's called a field margin, right? That sort of 1% to 3%. Those were incredibly effective. The 2008 campaign, I think, was really on the bleeding edge of using social media and the beginning phases of pretty robust text campaigns in order to drive out specifically the youth vote, which they focused on pretty hard. And obviously he won. So it was a successful program. Personally, I think looking back at the 2012 marriage campaign up here in Maine, where if you look at a similar initiative that happened in the state 3 years before, over the course of what was it, like 18 months of pretty solid campaigning, they actually were able to reverse the election results, and a lot of that was a pretty robust voter turnout operation and supporter turnout operation that was happening up here in Maine that year. So I think any race, though, where you have candidates who are being outspent by a significant margin and are winning by less than 2%, that is almost always attributed to an effective get out the vote and direct voter contact operation.
Yeah, and similar to how we were talking about voter contact and door knocking in general, what are some of the don't do's? What are the pitfalls to avoid in get out the vote strategy?
Yeah, I think going back to if you're having conversations where you're trying to persuade voters, it's probably not the time, and it's probably not the most effective use of what little time you have left. And I think making untested assumptions in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, I think, is a dangerous pitfall that I've seen a lot. But yeah, I think not having a plan and not being ready for the sort of tonal shift that happens as you move into the get out the vote program and disorganization. That's what I've seen kill campaigns. Disorganization on a structural level can really tank it. I mean, we've had people in this cycle who have won their race by 2 or 3 votes, right? Good party candidates who have won their races by 2 or 3 votes. And, you know, the difference was a very robust text and door program at the last minute. So, you know, I think ignoring GOTV, assuming it's too late, banking all of your votes on early vote or absentee vote, vote by mail, whatever you call it in your state. You know, I think they're very real, very common pitfalls, unfortunately. So.
We're going to get into the last section where we talk about tools and resources for managing get out the vote efforts. And then we're going to have about 10-15 minutes for any questions that are outstanding. So feel free to start dropping questions that you want us to answer in the chat for the Q&A section. But the good news is that goodparty.org has a lot of tools that we both partner with and that we've built specifically for candidates. And I want to pose to Derek, what are the tools and platforms that we have available that you think most lend themselves to voter outreach and get out the vote efforts? And how can folks on this call utilize them to the best effect?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to sort of taking a step back, I think one of the most important things about any direct voter contact operation is actually tracking that movement towards the goal. And, you know, through goodparty.org, one of the things we provide in the free suite of tools that we give independent, nonpartisan, and third-party candidates is an actual campaign tracker, right? It's something that will lay out what your path to victory is, will lay out very clearly how many voters you're going to contact through each method of contact this week, this month, this cycle. And I think it is crucial that folks get in there, get into goodparty.org and start using that tracker, because I think it will really inform so at least your efforts and maybe urgency throughout the rest of the campaign. So using those tracking tools that are already built into the system, I think, are huge. If you're like me, you're going to do a lot of your tracking in an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets, right? If you're not familiar with Google Sheets and you're just trying to sort of manage a very cumbersome data file, one of the tools and resources that you can use is your political associate with Good Party. Most of us will take the time to sort of build those large CSV files into more of a dashboard if you wanted to use it for phone calls or taking notes and things like that with the conversations you have with voters, adding drop-down boxes and stuff like that. Organizational tools, right? In terms of actual like ways to contact voters, we have access to a texting platform for all of our Good Party Pro members. And, you know, essentially for, you know, the at cost of the text, your Good Party political associate will help you, you know, figure out the right audience. They'll help you with your script copy. We like to do the replies and responses in real time. So we actually staff those text banks so that we can get right back to those folks in your community. So that's a huge tool that we have that folks can take advantage of. We'll be rolling out pretty soon Canvas tools for folks to use to better manage your door-to-door efforts and to keep that to keep those turfs managed and give you a good sense of your progress towards your door goal in a way that is very difficult when you're just trying to do it all on pen and paper. So there will be a full-scale Canvas app coming out for our pro candidates to use. But and there are some existing vendors, if you wanted to do like a predictive dialer or any sort of like auto dialer for mass phone calls. For most of you, you're probably going to be better off with a cell phone or attached to a Google Voice number. I will say, guys, you don't have to use your own personal cell phone for making phone bank calls. You can get a Google Voice number for free, and you can make the calls through that. But there are all kinds of tools that exist to facilitate the process of actually reaching out to voters. And we have access to a good chunk of. Oh, thank you, Rob. Rob put an overview of the goodparty.org tools there in the chat. So yeah, we have a lot of resources and a lot of tools to help you guys reach your goal.
Yeah. In addition to the tools that are listed here, as Derek mentioned, we also have a template library that will help you to write things like the door knocking script or the texting script, and to apply industry standard best practices, the things that longtime campaign managers like myself or Derek or other members of our political team kind of painstakingly over years of making mistakes and trying things out have learned are the most effective for moving the needle with people. And that campaign AI helps you to generate those things in minutes instead of staring at the blank page for long periods of time. Yeah. Any final thoughts on the tools and resources and how to make best use of those? Derek, any examples of folks who have done this to great effect that you want to highlight through your time with goodparty.org?
Yeah, so we are in the process right now. We have a pilot program launch for some folks that were testing this Canvas app. And the feedback that we've received has been overwhelmingly positive. I think what I've been very impressed to see with candidates all across the country is just how active and engaged they actually are with doing their direct voter contact. Even if sometimes they're shooting in the dark, I think the best resource that any of us have is going to be community. If you're not part of our Discord and not talking to other candidates about what they're doing and sort of the best practices that they're employing on their campaign every day, I'd be remiss not to bring that up, because I think that I do this whenever I see a no trespassing and no soliciting. So I will tell you guys that I feel very strongly about this. I used to, Rob's known me for a long time. And Rob, if you've ever seen one of my Canvas offices, I've had this quote by Justice Hugo Black up on my wall in a little frame talking about the vanguard of enlightenment, right? That's you guys, that's your candidate. You guys aren't technically trespassing when you canvass door to door. I will say there are different rules for candidates. It's a constitutionally protected activity, the right to canvass. So I will say, if you come up to somebody who has got a no soliciting sign on their door, or they want to get pushy about you soliciting, 9 times out of 10, it's not worth the argument. You can't convince somebody that you're not a solicitor if they come out and say, you're a solicitor, don't knock on my door. But functionally speaking, you're not solicitors, right? You're out there earning votes. So, but yeah, I think community is the best tool that we have here.
So let's go ahead and pivot into our final stretch of questions and answers for folks. Feel free, as always, to drop questions into the chat. I'm going to start with the one that I see here from Rich. Rich, no such thing as a dumb question. Rich says that he hasn't used his CSV file for his campaign yet. Would that help me in areas where there's a lot of second homes to figure out the real residences versus what are vacation homes? So in terms of using the voter file and CSVs to identify permanent residences versus vacation homes, any advice on that, Derek?
Yeah, I would say most people are registered to vote at their full-time home and not their vacation home. And so when you get that CSV and it has the enriched voter file that has the name, address, both the physical address with the registered to vote and the mailing address, and you plot that onto a map, I think it becomes fairly obvious where like the vacation parts of the community are. And I'll also say, just like, lean on your own knowledge of your community. There's a town not too far away from mine called Old Orchard Beach, right? Old Orchard Beach is a summer vacation spot. There's practically no population before June. And if you're going door to door trying to do some fundraising, you don't dip into OOB before June because nobody's there, right? So like, lean on your own knowledge of your community and combine it with some of that data. I'm sure that answer will be fairly easy to find.
Yeah, I'll give 2 anecdotes about this. Derek gives just reminders to me of. One is certainly pop open your Google Maps and put it on Street View for some of these, you might see a large concentration of registered voters. I've done some work recently in Arizona, and Arizona has a lot of gated communities that are on golf courses. And while it looked like a really wonderful high density turf area where all these homes were close together, all of them were totally inaccessible to be able to go and knock doors. And if we hadn't have checked out the maps ahead of time, we would have wasted a day by driving out there. There's also a kind of funny story about a campaign operative many years ago, and this made it into a movie at some point, but a campaign operative saw, oh, wow, there are a lot of single women whose search histories suggest that they're very interested in pro-choice and sort of abortion related issues. And so they sent a mailer to this community championing pro-choice issues for a particular candidate. And it blew up in their faces because that high concentration of women who cared about that issue and was looking into that issue, it was a convent of nuns. So it's not separating the data from the actual real life experience and digging in a little bit deeper to ask folks who are in that community. The separation of real life feedback from data led that campaign operative astray. Further questions from folks? Well, hearing none, I will move us into the sort of wrap up here. Derek, what do you think of as sort of the key takeaways? I have two kind of questions for you. One is, what are the things that you hope everyone comes away from this call knowing and sort of taking with them? And then I have a second question that I'll close out the call with.
Sure. I think to recap the key points here, contacting voters is one of the most important things a candidate or their campaign can do. A well-organized and active voter contact program can help you build stronger relationships and help you earn votes in November. Second, successful voter outreach programs are targeted, consistent, and purposeful. We talked about that a lot tonight. And I think that is sort of the big two takeaways I'd like everybody to walk away from, is that it's a strategy, and you gotta think strategically about it. Be targeted, purposeful, consistent.
So a late question here from Rob. The mention of gated communities made him think of apartments. Any tips for doing GOTV in apartment complexes, or I would even add dormitories to this? To me, this is an opportunity to ideally find one person who lives in that building who is a supporter, and being able to have them leave lit at each of those doors. And I love working with students, interns in particular at colleges, to do dorm storms where they knock every single dormitory door, because every college student who lives in a dorm has the right to register to vote at the dorm that they are living in. But finding basically an apartment captain can be helpful. And canvassers themselves can oftentimes get access to even these restricted entry buildings if they're polite and they ask for it. I wouldn't want to hinge an entire day of canvassing on that. But there are ways to be able to gain access to that and have permission. Any additional thoughts on that, Derek, before I give you the last question that I have?
No, I think that's the absolute best practice for dorms. Finding a student who lives in that dorm, or at least lives on campus, is going to be key. And same with apartments. I love the idea of apartment captains. I think that yeah, I wouldn't hinge my whole day of canvassing on it, but I think finding those folks in those communities who can get access to those buildings are going to be key, especially if you live in a very apartment heavy neighborhood.
Awesome. My last question for you, Derek, when it comes to voter contact, if you had to take all of your chips and push them in on one tactic, as a sort of one size fits all, and I know there's a lot of nuance to a lot of campaigns, but if you had to push your chips in on one tactic that you want every single candidate to employ in some way or another, what would that be?
Oh, I'm without a doubt, Rob. I'm going doors. I think again that opportunity for a face-to-face interaction with you, the candidate, is the most impactful way to persuade a voter to earn their vote, which is what you're there to do: earn their vote, right? And that's the best way to do it. Everybody should knock on doors this cycle. Every single person on this call, watching on IG, watching anywhere, you guys should be knocking doors.
Yeah, thank you to candidate McWilliams, who said that she knew we'd say doors. And she's glad to see that she's doing some things right here. So on that note, folks, I will say that we are here to help. As Derek had said, if you don't have a voter contact plan, reach out, schedule a call, and we can help you to go over your existing plan or to flesh out a new one as we enter the final stretch of the campaign. My colleague Quinn has dropped a link to a doc that tells you how to join our Discord. If you're not a member of our candidate Discord yet, it is where we plan the trainings that we're going to do, just like this one. So this is a good way to get day-to-day contact with people like Derek and myself. You can always ask us a question in the Discord. We always have it open as we're going through our work day. There are also other candidates there who you can share best practices with and learn from your peers. And we have volunteer teams, volunteers who are willing to help you with designing mail pieces, offering feedback on your website, writing for your campaign, making those text message replies for your campaign. Get access to those distributed volunteers. There's about 2,000 plus of those in our Discord. And clicking that link there will tell you, if you're not already a part of our Discord, how to get involved there. And if you're interested in spinning up a texting campaign, or if you're interested in being on the first wave of people to get access to the door knocking tool that we're using to make that door knocking effort a little bit easier on you, our PAs, our political associates like Derek and Alex, are ready to help get people to get those tools into their hands and out the doors in this final stretch towards November. So thank you all for being generous with your time. Thank you for being here with really thoughtful questions. This is every 2 weeks, one of my favorite things that I get to do at goodparty.org. So thank you all for being here, and good night. Thank you for coming.